Hello and welcome to another episode of Reviews Redux, where I take another look at one of my older reviews and bring it up to my more current quality standards. Today I'm taking another look at Castlevania Bloodlines, also known as Castlevania the New Generation in Europe, and while it was originally released for the Sega Genesis, or Mega Drive depending on which region you're in, it has since been re-released on several other systems. The footage you'll be seeing throughout this video was recorded from the Castlevania Anniversary Collection version of the game, which is available on Steam. This is an action platformer by Konami that was released in 1993 for the Genesis, and it saw release in other regions the following year. It was the only game in the entire Castlevania series to make it to the Genesis, or Mega Drive if you're from across the pond, and it was named 3 different things depending on which region you're in. The North American release was called Castlevania Bloodlines, and the Japanese version is called Vampire Killer, whereas the European and Australian version is called Castlevania the New Generation, because the PAL region version is censored compared to the Japanese and North American versions. So if you jump into Castlevania the New Generation, you'll find that the blood and gore effects have been either recolored or removed entirely. There's things like the detail of Eric's spear impaling him when he dies being removed from the game. There's things like the zombies being recolored because apparently they thought the zombies in this were gruesome. And then of course there's the most dastardly thing that is present in the North American version, which is the game's title, Castlevania Bloodlines, because apparently having the word blood, even if it's part of just bloodlines as in family lineage, is just too much for the European audience. They cannot possibly have that. It's just far too egregious. Anyway, the game was pretty decently received overall, and has gone on to become something of an overlooked classic in the Castlevania library, and of course the Genesis or Mega Drive library. And a lot of that is due to the fact that by the time this game came out, Super Castlevania 4 had been out for 2 years and was seen as superior in every possible regard. And it certainly didn't help that while the game was overshadowed in its day, it was never re-released until the Castlevania Anniversary Collection came out, and it is also included in the Sega Genesis Mini. But of course the question, now that the game is more widely available and people have more of an opportunity to take a look at it, is the game worth giving a try? Is it really an overlooked gem in the Castlevania series and the Sega Genesis library, or is it something else entirely? Well, let's go ahead and start delving right into it and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which is of course 2D sprite work, and it's generally pretty solid sprite work for the Sega Genesis, although in comparison to Super Castlevania 4 on Super Nintendo, it was noticeably less good looking. Now of course, that's not exactly an uncommon issue when you compare Genesis games to SNES games. More often than not, the SNES games look better. But Bloodlines is no slouch, and it still holds up rather well for the most part, especially with certain effects like the reflections in the water on the second stage, where not only is the water moving up and down, but the reflections are perfectly timed and everything. That's not to say the game doesn't have its issues. There's some odd flickering that will occur here and there, but that wasn't exactly uncommon for the era when things were starting to get a bit overloaded in the system memory. And there are some instances when a lot of stuff is happening on screen at once where the frame rate will slow down a fair bit, which is pretty annoying in an action game like this. Thankfully, you pretty much have to go out of your way to induce the slow frame rates by using a certain sub-weapon, which you will see me use on occasion in this, and you'll notice that the frame rate does tank a bit when you use it. But for the most part, the game runs very smoothly, and for a Genesis game, it looks rather good. Then you move over into the sound design, and you find that the sound effects are generally pretty solid, although there's certainly nothing impressive. They're pretty typical for Sega Genesis, which means that they're not especially detailed sound effects, and if you compare them to comparable SNES games, they're going to be a bit weaker, but overall they still get the job done, and there's nothing particularly egregious there except for the really obnoxious squeaking noise that occurs whenever you crouch as Eric. And then you move over into the soundtrack, and this is where I would like to remind you that a lot of people tend to consider the sound chip in the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive to be considerably inferior to the sound chip in the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom. And while there are certainly good and bad examples on both Super Nintendo and Genesis, that can generally be considered the case. The sound chip in the SNES or Super Famicom was certainly a more capable chip than what was in the Sega Genesis. But the chip in the Genesis was no slouch, and if you had somebody who really knows what they're doing, they could produce some pretty fantastic soundtracks on it. So of course the question there is, did they get somebody who knows what they're doing to make the soundtrack for Castlevania Bloodlines? Well, the answer to that question is that they got Michiru Yamane to do the score for Castlevania Bloodlines, and if you're not familiar with the name, you're probably still familiar with her work, especially if you're familiar with later games in the Castlevania series. Most notably, a little game you might have heard of called Castlevania Symphony of the Night. But before she did the soundtrack for Symphony of the Night, she did the soundtrack for Bloodlines, and unfortunately, a lot of Castlevania fans missed out on that because they either just didn't have a Genesis or completely overlooked Bloodlines. Which is a shame, because Castlevania Bloodlines has one of the best soundtracks in the entire Castlevania series. There is not a single bad tune in the entire soundtrack, although I'd argue that the Stage 3 music does eventually start grating on your nerves, not necessarily because it's bad music, but because Stage 3 itself is obnoxious for gameplay reasons. And while only a couple of the tracks, namely The Sinking Old Sanctuary and Iron Blue Intention, would stick with the Castlevania series and be reused in later games, the entire thing is just one kick-ass track after another, and there's even some remixed versions of older Castlevania songs like Vampire Killer and Bloody Tears, all of which are also fantastic. So while it may not be as technically impressive as Super Castlevania 4 was in a lot of ways, Bloodlines still has top-notch presentation, and that soundtrack has gone on to become one of the best in the entire Castlevania series. And considering how fantastic the music is in the Castlevania series, that's saying something. But of course, as solid as the presentation is, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, although it's mostly the gameplay because the story is not really much more than some basic context for why you're doing what you're doing. And the story in this is that in the early 20th century, Elizabeth Bartley, who is Dracula's niece, is trying to find a way to resurrect Dracula again after he was defeated by Quincy Morris in 1897. And her plan for resurrecting Dracula involves sparking a global war in order to use the souls of the dead to resurrect Dracula, and to that end, she works from the shadows to eventually start World War I. With the Belmonts having mysteriously vanished, it's up to a different generation of vampire hunters to ultimately track down Elizabeth Bartley and end this madness. Enter the two heroes of Castlevania Bloodlines, John Morris, the son of Quincy Morris, and Eric Lecarde. And regardless of which one you pick when you start the game off, they'll be going through the same set of stages, which will take them on a journey all over Europe, and eventually having them confront Elizabeth Bartley and a resurrected Dracula. As I mentioned before though, that's really just set up for the action, because there's no real story as you play through the various stages. You only get the intro sequence, which actually is only played if you just let it run at the beginning of starting the game up in general, and an outro sequence that basically just says, "Congratulations, you defeated Dracula, now this character is off to other adventures." And thus, as with most games of this era, and especially with this particular genre, this is not really a game that you're going to focus on the story of at all. You're really going to focus on the gameplay. So what exactly do we get with the gameplay of Castlevania Bloodlines? Well, if you've played previous Castlevania games to this, then it's going to be very familiar to you. It's of the old school Castlevania style, meaning that it's an action platformer where you go from stage to stage, you fight monsters, at the end of every stage you have a boss fight, and if you manage to win that boss fight, then you'll move on to the next stage. As you go through each stage, you'll find a bunch of objects that you can whack in order to drop items. These can be red or blue jewels, which are what count for your ammunition in this game instead of hearts like in previous Castlevania games, and the red ones count as 1 jewel, whereas the blue ones count as 5. And while those are going to be the majority of what you find when you whack the candles and torches and such like that, you're also going to occasionally find orbs which will make you invincible for a period of time, as well as bags of money which just give you points, coats of arms which are the weapon power-ups that will improve your weapon's capabilities, 1-ups which will give you an additional life, as well as the Mirror of Truth, which is what replaces the Rosary from previous games, which will wipe out all enemies on screen once you pick it up. There are also a couple of items you can get by destroying the secret walls, which will give you either a mutton chop, which of course replenishes life, or a spell book, which will give you one of two things. Either it'll be 20 jewels, or it'll give you the 3rd tier of weapon upgrade. In addition to these, there are 3 sub-weapons you can acquire, and a 4th one that will unlock when you hit that maximum weapon tier. The 3 normal sub-weapons, which you can just find scattered around the levels, are the Axe, Boomerang, and Holy Water, and each of these has a secondary fire function, where if you hold up on the D-pad and press the C button instead of just pressing the C button, it'll have a different effect, but will also cost more in gems. Instead of costing 1 gem, it will cost 4. Throwing out the boomerang normally will just send the boomerang off in the direction you're facing, and then it will come right back towards you. But if you use the secondary fire, it will send out 3 smaller boomerangs in a rotating pattern right in front of you. The battle axe normally throws out a large battle axe in a forward arcing pattern, so it will go up and then come down and not quite make it to the end of the screen. But if you use the secondary fire, it will spawn 3 small battle axes that go straight out. And if you use the holy water, well, don't use the holy water because it's terrible, but if you throw it out normally, it just creates a small splash on the ground, and if you use the secondary fire, it will send out a larger wave. Then there's the special sub-weapons you get when you max out your weapon power, and those will actually go away if you take any damage while you're at that maximum weapon tier. In fact, you'll also lose that weapon tier in general, so you need to be careful when you've got these. But these 2 special weapons will cost 8 jewels apiece whenever you attack with them, and there's no secondary fire function with them. They're also different depending on whether you're playing as John or Eric. Each one has their own specific weapon that unlocks once you hit that point, and they have very different functions. If you're playing as John, then you get the Water Dragon, which creates a whirlpool on the screen that shoots out and damages enemies. And if you're using Eric, then you get the Thunderbolt Spear, which sends out a massive array of attacks all over the screen. And that brings up something that's very important to mention. John and Eric play very differently from one another. Sure, the basic controls are all the same, but John uses the classic Castlevania whip, whereas Eric uses a spear, and they both use them to very different effects. And this is where the experience of Castlevania Bloodlines can differ pretty wildly depending on which character you're playing, because if you play as John and you've played previous Castlevania games, especially Super Castlevania 4, then you're going to find the experience very familiar as far as Castlevania games go. You go around, you whip things, you can whip in diagonal directions. If you jump, you can also whip downwards, but the whip control in this is considerably weaker than that of Super Castlevania 4. You can still do the whip swing, where you can whip onto things when you're jumping and use it to swing yourself forward, and you can keep doing that as long as you need to. But if you want to use the multi-directional whipping that was available in Super Castlevania 4, well, you just can't, because you have to jump in order to be able to whip diagonally or to whip downwards. You can't whip straight up. And while you're on the ground, you can only whip left or right. You can't whip diagonally or upwards at all. This makes John feel very restrictive compared to Simon Belmont in Super Castlevania 4 especially, but it's not quite as primitive as the whipping controls in the NES Castlevania games, so it at least has that going for it. That changes once you start playing as Eric Lacarde, because he has a spear, and when you're on the ground, you can spear left or right or up or diagonally, and you can even attack with the spear and continue holding the button down and moving left and right in order to twirl the spear around left or right and attack things in an arc around you. Now sure, you can't do the swinging like you can with the whip, but instead you get a pole vault, so you'll be able to crouch and then press the jump button in order to propel yourself very high up. So traversing the levels in Castlevania Bloodlines is going to be rather different depending on whether you're playing as John or Eric, and it does give the game some replay value, which is probably a good thing because this game's not particularly long. It's 6 stages of classic Castlevania action, and that means that you can knock the whole thing out in about 30 to 45 minutes depending on how good at the game you are. So a single playthrough may not necessarily be all that long, but you do have some replay value with being able to do it as a different character, and of course there is the fact that the game is fairly difficult, meaning that you're probably not going to be able to finish it on your first time through, and you're going to have to keep trying over and over again to eventually be able to beat the game. And I don't know about you, but for some reason the run killer for me is always the 3rd stage, which is the Leaning Tower of Pisa. It is a very vertical stage, and you have a whole lot of things flying in at you all at once, and if you get knocked off of the platform, then you'll fall to your doom almost immediately. And of course you have things like Medusa heads flying in at you, you have a bunch of harpies flying in at you that you have to hit a couple of times in order to be able to take them down, and at certain points you even have to deal with projectiles. So that stage is immensely frustrating, and it's made even more frustrating by the fact that the stage following it has one of the best songs in the entire Castlevania series, so you basically have to force yourself yourself to get through that stage in order to get to the good stuff again, and it makes it even more frustrating in my particular case because Iron Blue Intention is my personal favorite song on the entire Castlevania series. But here's the thing, even though I say that Stage 3 is the run killer for me, it's not the hardest stage in the game. There are harder stages after it. But I'm terrible at platformers, so most of the time I try to play this thing, I never get to those stages. So obviously your mileage with Castlevania Bloodlines is going to vary depending on whether you're better or worse at platformers than I am, or if you're on the same terrible skill level that I am. I mean, sure, it's not quite as punishingly difficult as Castlevania 1 and especially Castlevania 3 were, but it's still a pretty difficult game, and that means it's going to only appeal to the kind of people who can put up with that kind of difficulty and really get into these old school platformers. This of course does mean that old school Castlevania fans will definitely be able to enjoy it, although a lot of them will probably find it an inferior experience to Super Castlevania 4, which of course to some degree is true, but that doesn't make Castlevania Bloodlines a bad game. It's still a very solid action platformer for its era, it's just that the leap forward between Castlevania 3 and 4 was pretty massive, and when you go from Castlevania 4 to this, it's just a bit weaker in certain regards, although certain other elements are definitely very well appreciated, like the multiple characters, and of course the fantastic soundtrack. So if you're somebody who's into old school platformers, and especially if you're somebody who's a fan of the old school Castlevania games, you will find a lot to like here, and now that it is readily available in the Castlevania Anniversary Collection, the old console war excuses don't really apply anymore. So for those of you who were into old school Castlevania but never got a chance to play Bloodlines, or people who did play Bloodlines and want to be able to play it on modern systems, or if you are a fan of old school platformers but you just never really got around to playing the old school Castlevania games, you should check out the link in the video description box, because that'll take you to the Steam page for the Castlevania Anniversary Collection, which includes Bloodlines along with a bunch of other games, and it even includes the Japanese version of Bloodlines if you're interested in that. Just make sure that if you've played Super Castlevania 4 already, that you go into it with slightly tempered expectations, because again, it's not quite as refined as Super Castlevania 4 was, although it does have its own charms. Thank you all very much for watching, and if you like the kind of videos I make, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Every cent I get from that goes directly back into the channel, whether that be getting additional games for review, or additional equipment, or whatever the case is. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand, but the option is there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.